Hello, dear friends. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We will wait for 30 seconds and we will start the proceedings. Thank you. So first, let me go through some rules. This session will last for 90 minutes and there will be 4 topics, 4 speakers. And at the end, there will be Q&A session for 20 to 30 minutes. You can use the Q&A chat feature to share your questions and comments during the time. If possible, please mute yourself when the speakers are presenting, and also if possible, keep your videos off when the speakers are giving the presentation. Please use the raise the hand feature at the bottom of the screen during the Q&A session and wait for the moderator to address your name. Please avoid any kind of hate speech during the session. And there will be interpretation available. So at the bottom of the screen, you can see the logo, which is like a globe. Click on it and click on the channel in which you want to listen. For example, if you want to listen in Spanish, please click on the Spanish channel. If you want to listen in English, please click on the English channel. So these are some of the rules and etiquettes to be followed. And this session will be recorded and the link will be shared later on after the webinar. So dear friends and colleagues, I welcome all of you to this webinar organized by CBD Alliance. The aim of this webinar is to inform on the results of the COP15 in Montreal last December, to inform what happened at COP15, the wins, the red alerts, what is needed for inclusive, ambitious, transformational implementation of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Before our wonderful speakers give their presentation, I would like to take this opportunity to give the opening remarks as an overview of what happened at COP15. As you know, following on the adoption of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework at CBD COP15, the results were mixed. You might be knowing very well that a package of 6 decisions were adopted at COP15 that includes the biodiversity framework, monitoring mechanism, sharing benefits of digital sequence information, resource mobilization strategies. And this package of decisions were presented as take it or leave it deal. Therefore, as civil societies, we have to bear in mind to observe, watch, and keep an eye and give our inputs on all of the decisions that were adopted as a package. While there were major gains in the global biodiversity framework targets, for example, on the recognition of the rights of indigenous people and local communities, on gender equality, participation, and the protection of environmental human rights defenders, at the same time, the package of decisions were disappointing because it lacks strong text on horizon scanning or measures to reduce the risk of synthetic biology, GMOs, false climate solutions. The target on regulating business is also weak without mandatory requirements. And the biodiversity framework has opened the door for greenwashing, opened the door for private sector financing without any safeguards. It also failed to establish a new global biodiversity fund that was asked by more than 70 countries. Inclusion of terms like biodiversity offsetting and credits only allow for harmful projects, and that can also impact the lives of IPLCs who are dependent on biodiversity for their survival. The text environmental safeguards, though was included against to this biodiversity offsetting, is marginally helpful in this case. And the most concerning part for civil societies and right holders groups is the inclusion of nature-based solutions, which is an offsetting approach. And we have seen the kind of events organized by private groups to promote NBS at COP15. The target 30 by 30 protected areas in a way recognizes the territories of IPLCs and their governance systems. Still, one can assume that this allows to destroy the rest of the 70% of the planet while preserving the 30%. Lastly, the target on sustainable agriculture, where a term called sustainable intensification was used, which is a term generally used for genetically modified organisms for increasing agricultural production. With that, my dear friends and colleagues, I stop here, and now I request our honorable speakers for this webinar to carry forward the discussion from here on. And our first speaker is, before I introduce our first speaker, the webinar will be recorded and published in YouTube of CBD Alliance. So first, let me introduce our first speaker, who is going to talk on a very important and sensitive topic, rights participation 30 by 30. Ms. Vivienne Solis from CoopeSoliDar. She has participated in institutional and interdisciplinary projects of environmental education, academic nature on issues related to conservation and community use of biodiversity. I welcome Vivienne. She will be presenting, she will be giving her presentation in Spanish. So please use the interpretation accordingly. So Vivienne, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Bharath. Muchas gracias, compañeros de la Alianza del CBD, que me permiten estar aquí esta mañana desde Costa Rica. Muchos saludos para todos. Me voy a permitir compartir con ustedes un poco de la experiencia de América Latina y Mesoamérica en este tema del enfoque de derechos humanos que para muchas personas ha sido aprobado ahora en el marco global de biodiversidad y compartir cómo vemos este proceso. Y lo voy a hacer con énfasis en los temas marinos, que son los temas que hemos desarrollado en la organización a la cual represento. Para nosotros, este ha sido un largo y difícil camino. Es decir, hay un antes y hay un después del marco global de biodiversidad, en donde hemos luchado porque las voces de las personas que tienen derechos y muchas vulnerabilidades alrededor de los océanos, por ejemplo, pueda estar y ser parte de estas discusiones globales. En el 2017 se da el primer Congreso de las Naciones Unidas sobre los océanos, y ahí vemos un vacío muy grande de los sectores que tendrían que estar compartiendo la discusión de conservación de los océanos. Y a partir de ese momento se da la pandemia, donde desde la sociedad civil tenemos un retroceso enorme en la posibilidad de participación en la toma de decisiones de los gobiernos y otros sectores de poder que han manejado y manipulado muchas de estas discusiones globales, a llegar al 2022, donde nos proponemos apoyar en Lisboa una visión más desde los territorios, desde las personas cercanas a estos temas. Y aquí, en los temas marinos, es importante porque al escuchar esas comunidades, esas voces de pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales de las costas, se plantea la necesidad entonces de tener fuerza en este enfoque de derechos humanos hacia la COP15 en Montreal. Estamos en esa lucha todavía. En el 2023 y el 2024 representan un reto hacia la tercera conferencia de Naciones Unidas de los Océanos, donde va a haber un espacio también para discutir la implementación de este enfoque de derechos humanos en el marco global de biodiversidad. ¿Qué ocurre en este marco en términos de derechos humanos? Bueno, las palabras son las correctas. Tenemos que la implementación de este marco debería de basarse en una visión de derechos humanos, que quiere decir que los va a respetar, los va a proteger, los va a promover y va a conceder, a asegurar que se ejerzan esos derechos en las poblaciones más vulnerables, como lo son los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales. Pero hay un elemento importante también, y es que el marco reconoce el derecho humano a un medio ambiente limpio, saludable y sostenible. Si vemos uno de los retos más grandes que tenemos en la implementación del tema de derechos humanos en el marco es que deben de implementarse no solamente una o dos metas referentes a este tema, sino que hay muchas metas que tienen que ver con el tema de derechos humanos. El marco tendría que verse de forma integral, cumplirse de forma integral para lograr este tema de equidad y justicia en su implementación. Pero hay tres metas importantes que fueron mencionadas por Bharath que yo quisiera recalcar. La primera es la meta 3, o la meta del 30-30, como también se le conoce. Esta meta es importante, pero también ha desviado mucha de la discusión a un solo tema, que es el tema de las áreas protegidas y cómo el planeta se compromete en este marco global a hacer esfuerzos para conservar un 30% del mar o del continente, las aguas continentales o costeras, para el 2030. Es importante porque ustedes tienen ahí en rojo que dice que debe de reconocerse y respetarse los derechos de los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales. Quiere decir que esta meta aseguraría que podemos llegar a la protección de los mares y las tierras en base a tres modelos. Áreas protegidas bajo la gobernanza estatal, otras formas basadas en áreas o COMEX, como se les llama también, o bien bajo los territorios de pueblos indígenas o comunidades locales. El siguiente o la siguiente meta importante es la meta 22, que nos habla de aquellos derechos a la participación plena, equitativa, inclusiva y efectiva de todos los sectores. Y aquí se logra desde sociedad civil la atención al tema de la cultura, de los derechos sobre la tierra, de los derechos a los conocimientos tradicionales, de aquellos sectores que han estado más cerca de la cultura de uso sostenible de los recursos naturales y asegura la protección plena de los derechos de los defensores del ambiente y de la naturaleza, que para nosotros es un elemento fundamental. También la meta 23, que habla de la igualdad de género y que este marco global de biodiversidad debe de reconocer desde la igualdad los derechos a la tierra, a los recursos naturales y a los liderazgos plenos, equitativos, significativos e informados de las mujeres en la toma de decisiones que tienen que ver con los temas de biodiversidad.
The meaningful informed participation in leadership at all levels of action, engagement, and policy and decision-making related to biodiversity. Here we have the correct words for a more holistic vision, a more comprehensive view of the life of peoples that live on the islands, coasts, wetlands, and seas. This is translated to human rights, but we are also going to through the FPIC, the free prior informed consent of all, specifically 3530, the target 3 emphasizes and highlights the total recognition and the forms of government of indigenous people and local people. This was already in the CBD and should already have been fulfilled by states long before the GBF, in process that should move towards equity. But we have to go a bit further back to the history of this 30-30 target. This one arises from two positions. One, which is very close to the blue economy, but also to the green economy, which is related to the view of the use of resources for the benefit of the economy. This is related to the broad-scale tourism, hydrocarbon mining in seabeds, and large-scale small-scale
grupos que
agriculture.
promovían una
The other
visión de
second one
preservación
comes
tradicional de la
from groups
biodiversidad, es
motivated
decir,
by a traditional
solamente
vision
la
of
creación de áreas
biodiversity
protegidas,
conservation, the
básicamente
creation
bajo la
of
gobernanza estatal,
protected
y
areas
donde estos
under
patrimonios no
state
permitían ese uso
governance
consuetudinario de
where
algunas de las poblaciones.
which
Dos
did not
sectores
allow for the
se
use
unen y
of some resources
coinciden en
by
la
the
coalición de
indigenous
alta
peoples.
ambición por la
These come
naturaleza y las
together
personas que aglutina
in
a más de 100
a
gobiernos que forman parte del Convenio de
in a
Diversidad
high
Biológica.
ambition
Entonces,
coalition
sociedad
of
civil
people
tiene
which
un
brought
enorme
together more than
reto
100
para
government
dentro de
parties to
estos
the
dos
CBD.
marcos plantear una visión
So
de
both
respeto
of
y
these
de avance
visions
hacia la
came
equidad y la
together
justicia.
and
Y la
put
pregunta
forward
es,
a
¿cómo vamos a
view
implementar
towards the
entonces el
future.
marco
So
de
the question is,
biodiversidad
how
con
are we
esta
going
visión
to
de derechos
implement
humanos? Y el
all of
primer
this?
elemento que quizá
The
desde los
first
temas
element,
marinos tenemos
which
que hacer
from the
énfasis,
sea
es
matters
el derecho a la
should be
tenencia y al
highlighted,
acceso de los
is the
recursos
right
marino-costeros
to
de aquellos
tenure
pueblos indígenas
and
y comunidades
use
locales que han
of the
estado
coastal
cercanas al
areas
mar haciendo un
by
uso
the
sostenible y
indigenous peoples that
consuetudinario
live
de
in these
estos recursos.
areas so that
La
they can make
necesidad de
the
un
common
acceso
use.
preferencial
The
y un
need to
comanejo
have
de un
preferential
100% de
access
esas
and
áreas costeras con estas
co-management in
poblaciones
100%
que son o que tienen
by
derechos
these
históricos y
peoples
tradicionales
that
sobre
have
estos territorios.
historic
El reconocimiento de esos
rights over
territorios,
these
pero
lands,
también el
recognition
apoyo y el
of their rights,
fortalecimiento a la
the
resiliencia de esas
also
comunidades
the
que han
support
sido
to the
puestas en
resilience
alta
of these
vulnerabilidad
communities
frente a
which
los
have been
retos
placed
climáticos que
under high
tenemos.
vulnerability.
Reconocer aquellas
We
actividades de
must
uso de los
recognize the
recursos, como la
activities
pesca, no como una
which make
actividad
use of these resources,
exclusivamente
such as
económica
fishing,
para estas
as
comunidades,
not
sino como
only as the
una forma
economic
de vida
activity for
asociada a
these
la
communities,
cultura
but also
y
as a
al
way of life
conocimiento de
associated
estos
to
territorios.
culture and the
Los
knowledge
modelos de
of these
gobernanza deben ser
territories.
respetados y
The models of
reconocidos, no por
governments
el
must
marco
be
global de
respected and
biodiversidad, sino por
recognized,
la
not only
Convención
by
de
the
Diversidad
GBF, but
Biológica que ha
also
sido
by the
aprobada ya
CBD,
por los
which was
países, donde el tema
adopted
de la
by the
equidad y la
countries where
justicia son
the
elementos
matter of
fundamentales.
equity
Pero
and
eso
justice
requiere que los
are
países sean
vital. This
transparentes, los
requires that
gobiernos, y
countries
den
should be
rendición de cuentas
transparent
sobre el
and
manejo de
they
estos
must
recursos. Un
be
ejemplo
accountable
serían
with
las
respect to
pesquerías.
management
Y un
of these
compromiso real de
resources, an
proteger a los
example of which
pescadores
is the
artesanales
fisheries,
de
also the
pequeña escala
compromise,
de aquellos
the
sectores
commitment
que
to
compiten
protect
con ellos desde la
artisanal
economía azul,
small-scale fishermen
incluyendo aquí
who
el
compete
turismo, la
with
acuicultura
the
y la
blue
pesca.
economy, including
Preguntarnos
tourism,
una y otra vez,
agriculture.
¿para
We must
qué y
ask
para
ourselves
quién
once
es la
again, for
conservación que
whom and
hacemos?
for what
¿Cómo se
are
van a
the
establecer
conservation
las
that we are
nuevas áreas
carrying
de
out?
conservación
How are
marinas
we
o
going to
terrestres?
establish new
¿Cuáles
marine
mecanismos de
protected
información y
areas? Which
participación vamos
mechanism
a
for
seguir para
informing
cumplir
and
la meta? Y
participation
esta
are we going to
vez,
follow
el
to
cómo lo
achieve
vamos a
our
hacer
targets?
pareciera ser
And this time,
fundamental.
how we do
En
this
algunos de los
is
sectores, como el
vital.
sector
In
marino,
some
hay
sectors, such
elementos
as
que
in the
tienen
marine
que
sector,
seguirse.
there are
Por ejemplo,
elements
ya tenemos las
which must be
directrices
followed.
voluntarias
We have the
para la
voluntary
sostenibilidad de la
directives
pesca de
for the
pequeña escala en
sustainability
el contexto de
of
la seguridad
small-scale
alimentaria
artisanal
y la pobreza.
fishing within the
Los pescadores
context of
artesanales
food
presentan en
safety and
Lisboa un
eradication of
llamado a la acción
poverty. In
que menciona la
Lisbon,
importancia de la
they have called
participación de
to
la mujer,
action,
de la defensa
which
frente a la
is
economía
showing
azul,
the
de la
importance of
juventud en las
recognizing
pesquerías.
the right of
Estos son
women to
instrumentos que debemos de
participate in
utilizar
these
ahora
matters,
de
youth.
forma paralela
These are
a el
elements
marco
that we
global.
must use in a
¿Cómo se
parallel
aplica
way to the
entonces los
global
derechos humanos,
framework. So
esta
how do we
visión de derechos
apply
humanos en la
this
conservación del mar?
human
Por
rights
ejemplo,
vision in
no más áreas
the
marinas
Sea
protegidas sin
Convention?
el
No more
consentimiento libre,
MPAs
previo e
without the
informado de
free,
las
prior, and
comunidades
informed
locales
consent
y
of
los
local
pueblos indígenas
communities
y los
and
pescadores
the indigenous
artesanales.
peoples
No
and
más
the
ordenamiento
artisanal
espacial
fisheries.
marino
No
sin
more
esos
spatial
sectores sentados a
marine
la mesa y
management
compartiendo en
without the
igualdad de
fishermen
posición sus
sharing
visiones.
their
Asegurar
visions.
que
We
estos
must also
pescadores de
ensure
pequeña
that
escala
these
indígenas
small-scale
también
fishermen,
accedan a los
the
recursos del mar,
indigenous one, also have
implementando
access
todos
to the
los
sea
modelos de
resources,
gobernanza para poder
implementing all
proteger los
governance
recursos de
models
la
to be able to
biodiversidad,
share the biodiversity
reconocer y valorar el
resources,
trabajo de la mujer
recognize and
y de los
value the work
jóvenes
of
en las
women
cadenas de
and
valor,
youth
del
in the
uso
chain
y el aprovechamiento
values
de los
in the
recursos,
use
y
of
luego el
these resources, and
garantizar que se
finally
genere política
guarantee
pública
that we
incorporando la
generate
visión de los
that
jóvenes de estas
public
comunidades
policies are
y
generated
generando conocimiento sobre el
incorporating
manejo de
these
las
sectors
pesquerías
and
con los
generating
recursos
knowledge
desde el
on
conocimiento
management
tradicional
of
de estas personas.
fisheries,
El
also from
cumplimiento del
this
tema de derechos
knowledge.
humanos en el marco global de biodiversidad
The
ha
compliance
sido
with
un
human
reto
resources
antes
within
y
the
después de este
CBDs was a challenge before and continues to be after this framework. the framework contains vital elements for the defense of these rights. It must be sustained on the continual work supporting the most vulnerable sectors. My final call to our organizations who have been fighting for these rights to continue in this struggle so that these sectors may participate in all decision-making processes in the future. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Vivienne. Thank you so much. And also thank you so much for linking and explaining about each and every targets that are linked, associated with rights. And you put a very relevant question for whom and why we are doing this. And that is a very broad question. And that question should be there for all of us whenever we talk about biodiversity conservation. As you pointed out, the framework gives us a new opportunity, but this time we must do it right. Otherwise, we will lose and there will be no turning back. Thank you so much, Vivienne. Moving on, my friends. At COP15, we have seen a lot of side events related to nature positive, offsetting, carbon markets, mainstreaming, people coming from various backgrounds talking about mainstreaming a lot. Now, the next topic is mainstreaming, offsetting, and the influence of business. And to talk about this, we have Nele Marien. Nele Marien is an international program coordinator for forest and biodiversity at Friends of the Earth International. She has a background as an environmental negotiator and campaigner at the Climate Change and Biodiversity Conventions. I now welcome Nele.
Hello, good morning, good midday, good afternoon to everybody. I'll try to bring a bit the story of what has been the kind of corporate influence, but especially also what's the outcome of that and how this can be seen, as the corporate influence itself is sometimes a little bit more difficult to pinpoint down. I'm trying to share my presentation. Let's see, can you see this? Okay, yes. I think it should be all right. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk about 4 main topics, which I've presented here a little bit colorful. So my main focus will be on what are the outcomes of COP15 that are really relevant for understanding how much corporate presence there has been and how this is being pushed to make sure that really the economic interests, the corporate interests are not actually affected by the decisions of the COP. Because it is a thing that whenever there is economic growth, whenever there is corporate activity, it does affect territories, it does affect ecosystems, and the COP should have made real measures that stop this kind of ongoing onslaught of these ecosystems. And of course, the corporate sector was interested in making sure that this wouldn't happen. And this is visible in the outcomes. Then I'll also talk about some of the other effects of COP15, how we can see some shifting happening in how COPs used to happen before, how there used to be some kind of general understanding of working of the CBD and how we can see some shifts. Of course, and there will be some overlap, but there's a lot of false solutions in the text, and that of course brings an overlap with the outcomes of COP15. And then very briefly, I'll also mention the further work, which I think we should be taking into account for the next periods to come. So first, to start with the main outcomes, and I'll focus on targets 14 to 16, a little bit on mainstreaming and much less on finance and agriculture, as the next speakers will also take this on. So the main outcomes of the GBF, as I already mentioned, the economic sectors really could be quite damaged in their wish to have further profits by the GBF, as it should really be. There was the IPBES, which is the equivalent of the IPCC, they made a very good report before this process started, saying that transformative change is needed if we want to save biodiversity. And by that, they really meant that economic sectors should start behaving differently. So there was a lot of expectation of the global biodiversity framework responding to this and making sure that actions would happen that would restrict this effect on biodiversity by the business sectors. Actually, when we look at the outcomes, this doesn't really happen. The best part is target 14, which I've put here. I'm not going to read it in full, but it's just for your reference to have it. But it does talk about ensuring the full integration of biodiversity into policies, regulation, planning, etc., etc., etc. And it also talks about this doing it in all levels of governance. So this actually, it's very, very general, but I think this target gives us a task as civil society to work out what would we think this should mean and to come with this towards the next CBD meetings and say, this is what we really want it to mean. And I really want to put this on the agenda of us all as civil society of the CBD Alliance to come together to set up working groups to work this out and to come with coherent proposals, such as we did for the whole GBF. We now need to go into this level of detail. Now, the next very important target is a target 15, which talks about business. Very interestingly, for a very long time, this target started with just having business as a main focus. And we really complained a lot. And then they said, like, oh, yes, of course, it's self-evident that this is actually a government-based platform. So yes, it should be about legal, administrative, and policy measures. So they included that, and it's actually very good that there is a focus on policy measures. But then if you see what comes right next to it, these measures are to encourage and to enable business, which means that there is no strict regulation prohibiting them to do anything. So that actually undoes the fact that it's talking about legal, administrative, and policy measures. And then if you look at the whole structure of these targets, what we're seeing is that it's business doing a number of things, and it's business having the responsibility of doing this, and it's not governments really checking on them. Importantly, the first bullet point, the A, is about monitoring, assessing, and disclosing, which, as far as I know, monitoring hasn't ever really changed the impact itself. Monitoring can be an important step if that leads to further regulation that then stops the impacts, but that doesn't happen. Or that's not required, not indicated here. The other thing is that it talks about risks and dependencies of the business on biodiversity, and the impacts comes only later. And this can also be seen later on in the indicators, that there's a lot of attention to the risks of that business have of biodiversity decline. And while for us, really what it should be about is about the impacts that business have on biodiversity loss itself. Then next bullet point is about providing information needed for consumers. This links very strongly to target 16, so I'll talk more about it there. Then the next one is on access and benefit sharing. This also relates to the DSI discussion, and it relates to the Nagoya Protocol, which has never been properly implemented. I will leave this to next speakers, but in it as just a general comment, to have this here within target 15 doesn't seem like it's going to strengthen a lot the other regulation which hasn't been implemented anyway. Then also one important thing is there is a reference to the negative impacts on biodiversity. I think we might be able to use this as civil society to see, like, okay, this target talks about legal, administrative, and policy measures to reduce negative impacts on biodiversity. I think the lawyers will really need to sit on this to see how strong this can be used in the setting of how this target is composed, but there could be some opportunity. Interestingly, a lot of people will be happy with having the positive impacts there. But if we look into that, actually, what are positive impacts by business? Business generally don't have positive impacts. But what this really relates to is by the fact that a lot of businesses are claiming that they destroy some ecosystem and they will, through offsetting, restore a bit more. And that is the positive impact. We don't consider this to be positive because the offsetting doesn't work. And it actually allows business to do the destruction anyway. And there's much more claims for future of offsetting areas for future restoration, and it's actually feasible. So it's a beautiful wording in there, but actually it's quite deceptive. Now, I already made reference to the information needed to consumers, and that's exactly what Target 16 is about. It really transfers a lot of the responsibility to individual people. It talks about ensuring that people are encouraged and enabled to do the sustainable consumption, to have sustainable consumption choices. How can they do this? They should do this to having the right kind of information, etc., which is normally labels on products from corporate entities, from corporations. Who then put in the supermarket, oh, this is a green label, and everybody believes it and pays for this. Now, there's a whole lot of problems with this. For one, because it takes away the responsibility from states to regulate the corporations to do the right thing, and it puts this responsibility to consumers who don't have the capacity to, if one needs for every product one buys, needs to do an in-depth study, that doesn't work. Worse is that actually buying such products is only available to first world, global north, middle class. People with less economic resources, a lot of people in the south will just not have the possibility to access such kind of consumption. And then they seem to be blamed for this. So this is really not something that should be as a result of a global biodiversity framework that should give a global response to things. Worse is that actually a lot of these labels are actually very, very deceptive. And so actually, I do think that there is a lot of things we can use this as civil society where we can use this positively, even though I'm absolutely not happy with this target and the philosophy behind it. I think it's essential that as civil society, we work on it. And we say that policy frameworks should go beyond these certification schemes. And therefore, the relevant information should be there, and states should be obliged to make sure that the information is right, which quite often it isn't. Therefore, we could even do legal cases to oblige states or to oblige corporations to provide the right kind of information and to have punishments for where it's not. Another interesting thing in this target is that it talks about the equitable reduction of footprint, and about reduction of overconsumption, which really are very important, and we should make proposals to have policy frameworks that can go in this direction. I think this is again one of those things where as civil society we really should come together and work on this. Then there was for a long time a long-term action plan on mainstreaming in the making, which was hugely problematic. It was full of false solutions, corporate influence, etc. The Secretariat was really pushing to get it approved, to just have countries welcome it without even ever properly discussing it. Then there was a proposal for a technical expert group to further work on the implementation on it. And there was a proposal to institutionalize a specific network that was set up by the Secretariat, the Extended Consultative Network, which brought in a lot of corporate actors. None of these things came actually through in the COP. There's just a decision to say that the whole thing needs to be retaken in the next SBI. So this is really a very good news, because it means a setback of the whole process to where we were in 2019. It still is quite problematic in a sense that the texts which are there and which will still be worked upon are very neoliberal, and also that a lot of the countries who opposed this did it not because it was too neoliberal, but actually because they thought it was still too intrusive in their economies. So the expectations are still not good, but we're actually very happy that it was postponed. And yeah, this is also, again, a huge task for civil society to start working on this and make clear that what it is that we as civil society think that this chapter should look like, and to have constructive proposals there. I'm seeing Bharath's hand, so I'm afraid that my time is getting up. Well, actually, I had still quite a lot of other things, but maybe I should just stop it here, or should I go very quickly through the rest? I don't know.
You can conclude in 90 seconds, Nele.
Okay, I'll do that. So yeah, one other thing which we have seen is that there's a lot of change in how corporate actors participate. There was a huge amount of pavilions, of speaking opportunities, etc. for the corporate sector. Also, there's a lot of funding coming in from a corporate related sector. For example, the Business Foundation came and announced the 10 billion funds. And this also means that states and even some indigenous peoples have shifted their expectation and are not expecting so much of the funds from the state anymore and are turning towards these private funds. But of course, this means that the influence of corporations will keep on growing. So this is also a huge concern there. Then just a few words on false solutions. I should really have left a lot more time for this, but nature-based solutions, it has been mentioned before. It's twice in the text, in target 8 and in target 11. It can really open the door for offsetting schemes whereby biodiversity is being put in function of climate offsetting. So it's biodiversity that should capture all the carbon. This is hugely problematic. However, the context in which it's put in the GBF is relatively a little bit better because it's always put together with ecosystem-based approaches. And it's also in a context of adaptation, disaster risks reduction, and different kind of topics which aren't necessarily the carbon capture, but it's also there. So this is, it's not good that it's there, but at least it's the context is slightly better than it could have been. Very important also is no net loss and nature positive, which was very strongly pushed. It was meant to say like, okay, this is an overall outcome of the COP whereby it's okay to lose certain areas of biodiversity as long as more is being restored. This didn't get through in the COP, so that's very positive. However, what we are seeing is that the basic philosophy of the GBF is still like that. It's still positive. It's still possible to keep on destroying and to say that one restores, and that's the overall indicators are then positive. So while the wording is out, the concern is not out, and we really, really will need to work on this as civil society. And then just as a very last thing, I think where we also need to concentrate our further work is not just at the CBD level in the negotiation, but also in the countries, in the national biodiversity strategies and action plans, where we also are already expecting a huge corporate influence. And we will need to make sure there's a lot of work on the indicators, which will also either enhance or reduce the amount of corporate influence and the possibilities for false solutions to be there as a way of measuring the outcome or not. So I'll leave it there. I'm sorry I left some important things out, but we can probably deal with them also in questions and answers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nele, for explaining very broadly about the influences and the relevant targets related to business, corporate capture, and pointing out about nature positive, nature-based solutions, and also explaining like if we don't ensure liability, take legal responsibility and accountability of businesses, then it can lead to negative impacts on biodiversity and human rights. So thank you so much, and I think definitely there will be Q&A session. That time you can, that time you can explain further, because as you also pointed about funding, now without funding, I think there won't be any action. And equity is the core part of biodiversity protection. So to talk next, we have Lim Li Ching, who is going to talk on equity, resources, and finance. Lim Li Ching worked who has been working on biosafety and sustainable agricultural programs, resource mobilization from Third World Network. She is also the lead author of International Assessment on Agricultural Science, Technology, Knowledge for Development. In the past, she was also the co-editor of Climate Change and Food System Resilience in the Sub-Saharan Africa, published by FAO. So we are very glad to have Ching here. Ching, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Bharath, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I have a few slides that I will just use for illustration purposes, so I hope someone can share that while I speak. Thank you. Yeah, if you put it in full screen, yeah. Thank you very much. As Bharath said, I'm speaking on equity, resources, and finance, and that is actually a very huge topic, but I will try and distill a few key points. I think we've heard, particularly from Vivienne at the start, that there were major gains in the targets on the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, on gender equality, on participation, protection of environmental human rights defenders. And this is very important, and we do celebrate this. But what we are worried about is that all these good things on rights and equity for local communities and Indigenous peoples can actually be systematically undermined by the failure of the GBF to seriously tackle systemic issues driving biodiversity loss. And Nele pointed to some of these already. And of course, as civil society, we want system change, but system change needs to have equity embedded within. And the CBD, of course, is a real convention, and it actually incorporates the principle of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities. Now, if you show the first, next slide, please. Now, just to say that what we're talking about here is not about equality, but about equity. And common but differentiated responsibilities means that developed countries actually bear the greater responsibility to address biodiversity loss, because A, they have contributed more to global environmental degradation, and B, they have more command of appropriate technologies and financial resources that could help address biodiversity loss. Now, we need to bear this in mind to ensure that there is equity in order to help more those who have less, and that's what the picture on the right is showing. So the question we have now that we have this Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is, does it adequately incorporate equity? I'm going to make 3 points on this and the work ahead that is needed. The first is in terms of the fair sharing of the burden of actions and provision of the means of implementation. We know that most of the world's remaining biodiversity is actually in developing countries. And the burden for action and implementation lies heavily on them and also on the IPLCs from these countries. But at the same time, what we saw in Montreal and in the lead up to Montreal is that developed countries of the global north have pushed very strongly for increased planning, monitoring, reporting, and review obligations of the GBF, in addition to the raised ambition in the goals and targets. But it is unfair that they don't want to provide the resources to developing countries so that they can take the action and also to monitor and report and review. That's why we saw really entrenched north-south fights in the negotiations, particularly in Montreal, with developing countries insisting on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. They came together in a like-minded group comprising more than 70 developing countries. And you may have heard that at one point, they walked out of the negotiations during the resource mobilization discussions. Now, there were 2 key demands from the like-minded group. They demanded, firstly, that developed countries meet their legally binding obligations to provide financial resources to them. Now, this is in Article 20, paragraph 4 of the Convention. And they had asked for at least $100 billion annually to match the ambition in the climate change sphere. But the relevant GBF target 19, only aims to increase resources from developed to developing countries to at least 20 billion per year by 2025 and to at least 30 billion per year by 2030. Now, this is a small proportion only 10 to 15% of the figure in the overall pledge to mobilize $200 billion per year. One really wonders where the other 85 to 90% of that money is going to go to, surely not to developed countries. Now, in contrast to this lack of financial resources and commitment, the enhanced multidimensional mechanism on planning, monitoring, reporting, and review that was finally agreed includes elements that are much enlarged from the CBD's requirements of NBCEPs and national reports. This is therefore not equitable. And COP15 also failed to establish a dedicated global biodiversity fund, as called for by the like-minded group. Now, there was a compromise proposal, which was to set up a trust fund under the Global Environment Facility, or GEF. But this is seen by most developing countries as inadequate, as financial flows through the GEF have been beset with problems, and developing countries have had problems accessing these funds. Now, a last-minute further compromise which held up the negotiations late into the final night, it actually introduced a sunset clause of 2030 for this new trust fund under the GEF. And it also opened a door for further future consideration of a standalone global biodiversity fund under the authority of the COP, which was what was demanded by the like-minded group. Now, what happens next will have to be worked out through the intersessional processes set up on resource mobilization, particularly the advisory committee. Up to 10 spaces on this advisory committee are reserved for representatives of stakeholders, indigenous peoples and local communities, women and youth. So we really need to be active there. The second point I wanted to make on equity was around the issue of fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources, the CBD's third objective. There was actually an important breakthrough at COP15. There has been an explicit agreement to fairly and equitably share the benefits arising from the use of digital sequence information, or DSI, on genetic resources. And there's also clear recognition that any monetary and non-monetary benefits should primarily be used to support conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and benefit indigenous peoples and local communities. Now, these are good things that these principles are recognized. However, nothing is finalized yet, because what has only been set up through the COP15 decision is a process that is supposed to be fair, transparent, inclusive, participatory, and time-bound to work out all the details. And an ad hoc open-ended working group, this is a negotiating group, which will undertake this work. So it's extremely crucial that these negotiations are on our radar as civil society. Now, there's a link to resource mobilization because the DSI decision also establishes a multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing from the use of DSI, including a global fund. Now, whether and how it's the GEF Trust Fund or some future dedicated global biodiversity fund or something else altogether, which would be the entity to receive and disperse any revenue generated by DSI benefit sharing. All this will have to be worked out by the Advisory Committee on Resource Mobilization in the next 2 years. So you can see we have a lot of work ahead of us. The third point I wanted to make around equity was on the issue of equitable fair shares regarding sustainable use of biodiversity. Now, we know that resource extraction from developing countries that began since the colonial era continues today. It's driven by corporations, rich countries, and global elites. And this is what has caused the biodiversity crisis. Developed countries have become rich, and overconsumption by the rich world is causing biodiversity destruction in poor countries. If you could show the second slide, please. Now, this is from a paper recently published in Lancet Planet Health on a fair shares assessment of resource use. And it demonstrates that high-income nations bear the overwhelming responsibility for global ecological breakdown and need to urgently reduce their resource use to fair and sustainable levels. High-income nations, and you can see from the dark blue shaded part of the, not this slide, sorry, it's the slide before. Yes, in the dark blue shaded plot, that is the proportion of what high-income nations are responsible for? They're responsible for 74% of global excess material use, whereas they only have 16% of the world population. And for middle-income countries and the least developed countries, low-income countries, that proportion is much lower. In fact, for low-income countries, you can't even see it on the graph because they consume so much less than the rich world. And what's made worse is that the majority of the ecological pressure from excess consumption in rich nations is actually outsourced to poor nations, causing ecological damage in the latter. But as Nele has explained, Target 16 only has very vague language to reduce the global footprint of consumption in an equitable manner. Now, this will have to be much better defined and disaggregated in the implementation and monitoring of the GBF to ensure that equity is really built into the actions to reduce consumption. There is no headline indicator for Target 16 yet, and a binary indicator is still to be developed. So the RTEC on indicators that is going to be set up and the online discussions on the monitoring framework that will be organized will have important work that civil society should track. So I'm going to conclude here by saying that what I've talked about really is about a question of justice. Because developing countries are not begging for more money or to escape responsibilities for biodiversity protection. Indeed, we must continue to hold them accountable for what they have agreed in terms of the goals and targets of the GBF. But actually to point out that there is an ecological debt owed to the developing world and to the indigenous peoples and local communities who are our best stewards of biodiversity. And in fact, if you show the last slide, please, you can see that developing countries and its peoples have actually been subsidizing the developed world over centuries from colonialism, and this continues to today. This slide is from a recent study which values the cumulative net drain of resources flowing from developing to developed countries between 1990 to 2015 at 242 trillion US dollars. You can see that the share of what developing countries are exporting to developed countries, as shown in the lower half of all these graphs, whether it's raw materials, energy, labor, it's much more than what they're importing. So actually, they are owed an ecological debt. And we have to see all this in the context of structural issues, such as unfair debt that developing countries are drowning in, especially after the COVID pandemic. So, I mean, these are big, big questions and big issues that we need to recognize, acknowledge, and work on to right these wrongs. And I think as civil society, our narrative needs to include the issue of equity, to weed out the false solutions that continue to perpetuate injustices and inequity. So in summary, I would say that as an overall assessment of, it's unfortunate that equity has been largely excluded from the GBF. But there are opportunities for further engagement in the intersessional work processes, especially on resource mobilization, on DSI, and on indicators, and particularly as the GBF is implemented nationally in our own countries. So I think this is our challenge, to ensure that equity is fully included in all our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ching, for that enlightening presentation and talking about the fundamental issue of justice and equitable fair shares regarding the sustainable use of biodiversity. Regrettably, that was regrettably largely been ignored in the GBF. But thank you so much for your presentation. We look forward for some questions. As you know that the technological part has been a core topic at the CBD negotiation discussions, and we are still not sure where it is going to end without proper monitoring and assessment of new technologies that are emerging, such as synthetic biology, GMOs. To share the perspectives on Techno-fixes, we have Ms. Sabrina Masinjila from African Center for Biodiversity, who worked on research, campaigning, networking, and advocating around biosafety, seed systems, and agricultural biosystems. So now I welcome Sabrina.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
You're just checking if you can hear me.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, great. So I'm just gonna share my slide. I don't know if you can. I can't see it from my side. Can I ask someone please to share from the other end? Oh, let me try again. Okay, now it's up.
Yes, it is.
Okay, okay, great. Okay, so I'm just gonna switch off my camera, sorry, but just to say thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, and thank you for the invitation to speak. And as introduced, I'm Sabrina Masinjila, and I work at the African Center for Biodiversity and will provide some key insights on Techno-fixes on the GBF. So I think as my colleagues have already shared that the GBF was adopted, was a mixed bag. There were quite decisions that on one hand had good elements, and on the other hand, we had targets that had bad elements that might have further impact on biodiversity. So I think one of the things that has been talked mostly about has been the false solutions, and Techno-fixes are also part of this huge body of false solutions that have been seen as one way to solve the current crisis, multiple crises that we're facing. But I just want to highlight, key issues that that have been proposed under the GBF, particularly also as a package, which I think as initially Bharath also introduced and said the GBF has been adopted as a package. So some of the decisions that have been adopted, sorry, my slide, have been related to the the push or for the push for adoption of science and technology. Particularly, I just want to highlight one of the decisions. For example, the long-term strategy framework for capacity building and development, which has a strong emphasis on science, technology, and innovation. And as much as we are in a modern society and in a modern world where science, technology, and innovation is key for development, but we look at this as proposals for, genetic engineering and the modification of food and agriculture, use of genetic engineering in health, medicine, among others. Now, while new and emerging technologies such as synthetic biology pose risks and potential adverse impacts on human and animal health, social, cultural, and economic spheres, this warrants, the need for these technologies to be anticipated, monitored, and assessed. But however, what we're seeing, particularly under the discussions and under the CBD and under the convention the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, we're seeing that the precautionary principle as enshrined under the CBD is being undermined with each negotiation by industry, big biotech crop countries, as we saw in the COP15. Now, for example, with the GBF, as I have mentioned, it has a strong focus on science, technology, and innovation. So, for example, if you see under the section under considerations for implementation, which has a variety of a list of measures that parties should take into consideration when implementing the GBF. Science, technology, and innovation has been clearly highlighted, but this is without the balance of the precautionary approach or of horizon scanning, monitoring, and assessment. And we also see that particularly if you look at specific targets, such as target 17, which was on biotechnology and biosafety, now it fails to contain any language, particularly on technology assessment, on precaution. And this is really worrying because, with these emerging technologies, parties may not be able to identify and assess these new technologies, including this synthetic biology and genetic techniques. And we know that, for example, in countries in the global south, particularly like Africa, where biosafety and the push for GMOs is more every day, the push for GMOs to solving our agricultural system challenges, we have no capacity at all even to deal with the old technologies. And now with the new emerging technologies going to be further a challenge. So the fact that the GBF fails to actually consider precaution and actually consider assessment of these new technologies is also seen as blinding it, particularly as this development go further regulatory abilities. Now, I just want to highlight some of the key issues, particularly with regards to target 17. So during the discussions on target 17, I think there was parties there were parties that had wanted to have horizon scanning, monitoring, and assessment, but this was really pushed against by the big biotech countries. But also there was opposition around socioeconomic considerations. And this was after a lot of compromise and arguments and fights between different parties that this was left out. So the language that we have on the GBF is still weak. It still points to language within the CBD, for example, linked to Article 8G and Article 19. And also I just wanted to highlight some of the interrelated targets, and as my colleagues have already mentioned, that the GBF targets, you cannot look at it just at one target and each and every target on its own. The targets are interrelated and have to be implemented together. So for example, target 10 on agriculture is related to other targets. This target is related to target 7 on reducing pesticides, which has language on reducing pesticides and highly hazardous chemicals, target 18 on climate, target 17 on biotechnology, among others. So the final text that we see on the outcomes of the GBF, we see two opposing paradigms, where we have agroecology and we have sustainable intensification. And sustainable intensification is, some farming system that is really pushed by the industry, because it sort of encompasses that whole monoculture, use of corporate seed, use of pesticides, and even the use of genetically modified seed. So in its sense, we see that the pairing of agroecology and sustainable intensification will sort of go ahead and undermine any achievements that agroecology will have, particularly in the halting and reversing of biodiversity loss. So it is also important when we look at these different targets, particularly and the interconnectedness of target 10, and target 17 and target 7, target 8, how we bring perspectives around biosafety measures, perspectives around precaution during discussions at the when we are implementing, consulting at the national level, and implementation towards implementation of the global biodiversity framework. Also, I just want to highlight particularly under the COP decisions, which of course not under the GBF, but there are COP decisions under the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, particularly the synthetic biology agenda, which was linked to the discussions under Target 17. Now, under the synthetic biology agenda, the issue around whether this was a new and emerging issue was highly contested. But as we saw with the fights between the big biotech countries and some of the other parties. So the issue has the new and emerging issue was contested, and that means that any reference for horizon scanning, monitoring, and assessment for future will be an issue. And at the moment, also the need for the broad horizon scanning for new technologies, including synthetic biology, is still there, but this is only for one intersessional period with no guarantee of continuation. And as also with Target 17, aspects around socioeconomic consideration, environmental risk assessment, which were also contentious issues, were deleted after a compromise. The good thing under the synthetic biology agenda is there is a provision for multidisciplinary in the ad hoc technical expert group on horizon scanning, monitoring, and assessment, which ensures a participatory process, which brings in a broad range of scientific disciplines, as well as interdisciplinary and intercultural expertise from indigenous people and local communities. So at least this will ensure a balance of perspectives when it comes to the horizon scanning and technology assessment on these new and emerging technologies. So even though there was this contestation on synthetic biology, whether this is a new and emerging issue, parties not wanting to discuss it because it will impact on the status quo, or it will have impact on the biotech countries. There is still opportunity under the CBD where it has principles of precaution and biosafety, and it also has obligations to parties under Article 8G and Article 19, which are relevant and which ensure that there'll still be monitoring and assessment of new technologies, including also Article 7 on identification on monitoring and Article 14 on impact. So there's still room to ensure, for those parties that are those countries that are members and parties of the CBD, to ensure that they still fall back to their obligations under the CBD when it comes to these new and emerging issues. There are also other processes related to synthetic biology and further intersessional work. So just disregard the title on the slide. So for example, we had discussions under agenda item on risk assessment and risk management. We had agenda items on detection and identification, and also on socioeconomic consideration. So all these decisions that were discussed at the COP still have languages that, for example, under risk assessment and risk management, to develop guidance, materials to support risk assessment of living modified organisms containing engineered gene drives, which are also arise from the use of synthetic biology. So there's still some intersessional work going forward, and I think if some of you might have seen a call for invitation to take part in online forums, nominations, because all these decisions that are being taken at this international level will have implications not only on national decision making, but also on the future of international decision making when it comes to new and emerging technologies. Now, just to conclude, what next? And I think, as my colleagues have also alluded to, there's still work that will need to be done at the national level, the revision of the old NBSAPs to incorporate the new GBF. We still feel that, you know, the adopted GBF was a missed opportunity and a lost chance to take forward the discussions on biosafety in the context of halting and reversing biodiversity loss, particularly when you look at this new and emerging issue. But still, I think at the national level, when parties embark on the revising of their NBSAPs, I think it's important that we push to ensure that principles of precaution are taken into account, and even issues of socioeconomic consideration, issues on horizon scanning, monitoring and assessment. And this will also be for any future negotiations under the CBD. Just to end and say that, you know, it will be extremely important for civil society and social movements, IPLCs, women, youth, particularly in the global south and in Africa. I'm speaking of Africa because this is where, you know, everything is dumped. Technologies such as GMOs are being dumped and pushed onto our food and agricultural systems, that we campaign for appropriate responses to the multiple challenges facing biodiversity loss. And these solutions on responses have to be those that are democratic, participatory, socially just, ecologically sustainable, and those that don't rely on techno-fixes. So I'm just going to end there, and thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this webinar.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. Thank you so much. And you are right, without the principle of precaution in the NBSAPs and without proper monitoring, the decisions on genetic engineering through synthetic biology has to be, we have to see how they go from here. And thank you for that very enlightening presentation on the technology part of biodiversity. Now, I think I read some of the questions that were put by our participants here. So let me take one by one. I see a question, maybe it is directed to Nele. It is regarding target 15, where there was no, where in the presentation, in your presentation, there was no mention on the deletion of element from the draft, which read, take legal responsibility for infractions, including through penalties, liability, redress for damage, and addressing conflicts of interest. This is a key loss in comparison to the draft. So Nele, would you like to respond to that question?
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, I think I didn't quite take the time to explain the elements we lost. It's definitely this one. Where actually the way it was worded in the draft was already a little bit strange, because it wasn't clear who was supposed to take the legal responsibility, and we really thought it should be states, but that wasn't clear because the heading was about business. The other thing, and I would say almost more important, that was lost from the draft was the responsibility of business, and then from our perspective of states to follow up on that regarding human rights. There is very good human rights text in other parts of the framework, so we definitely celebrate that. But in a view that business are, especially corporations, are the major culprits of a lot of the human rights violations, we actually thought that it was key that this should be in this target, and it was completely lost. So the legal responsibility for infractions and the human rights are two very important elements that are lost. And in general, as we have been saying, this target 15 just does not live up to the expectations of regulating business in such a way that they cannot cause the harm they are currently doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nele. Then there is a question on where can we find the most current drafts of the indicators? Would someone like to respond on that? I think if I may say so, there is already a nomination for experts to develop the indicators for the goals and targets. Already it is notified. I think it is in the process right now. And there is a question on what is the current fate of NBSAPs. I think they will be asked to revise and update till COP16. Then there is a very important question. I think this is directed to Sabrina. I assume that. I have two small questions regarding agriculture and biodiversity. What are the perspectives, levers, and barriers within the COP biodiversity in order to promote the development of resilient and environment-friendly agricultural initiatives, support the adoption of an appropriate framework to monitor and evaluate the commitments of the parties? I think, Sabrina, would you like to respond to that question?
Thank you, but can you please repeat the question or type it in the chat?
Yeah, it is already in the Q&A chat feature where it is mentioned about, like, 1 second. Oh yeah, it is about regarding agriculture and biodiversity. What are the perspectives, barriers within the COP biodiversity? I think Ching already responded to that question, where in order to promote the development of resilient and environment-friendly agricultural initiatives, support the adoption of an appropriate framework to monitor and evaluate the commitments of the parties. Let me see, what is the other question we have? Do you know according to which criteria the ad hoc technical experts will be appointed and how the work of this group will be organized? I think this is on indicators. Someone would like to respond to that question? So I will go for the next question then. Could you please throw light on the strategies to be adopted for getting the desired results related to biodiversity?
Maybe I can say something about that, Bharath.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, I think that as I tried to mention, this is an issue that it's not going to start with the global biodiversity framework, but it has to keep going. The fight of civil society for a more holistic way of approaching the issues related to the conservation of biodiversity has to keep going. There are some push forward and backwards with this global biodiversity framework, as we have tried to share with all this morning. But I think that the most important part is that we really need to get as possible working together with these communities that are very vulnerable and to discuss the issue of equity, as Lim has very clearly stated, related to also financial issues. And how can we really keep going on the ratification for everybody of these human rights that are now missing in a lot of areas and territories. So I think that the important part, of course, is the monitoring framework that it's now going to be discussed. And unfortunately, some of the key issues like tenure rights and access rights are not still well positioned there, where they have to be to make sure that these issues of justice and equity are considered. But I think that we need to keep going. We need to keep working in the territories with the communities, with the people, and pushing and making obvious to the governments and big enterprises that they're not doing the job. And I think this is a business that we'll see, and how our organizations and social movements are able to really present this position is very important at the moment, I think.
Thank you so much, Vivienne. We will see if there is any last question. What does HSMA means? Can somebody?
Bharath, I think that has also already been answered. It's horizon scanning, monitoring, and assessment. Sorry, okay. I just had to put it in short so that it doesn't take much space.
Okay, no problem. Okay, I think that was fantastic. Maybe there is one question we will take because we have 10 more minutes. So in your opinion, have the civil society organization had a substantial impact on the decision in the last COP15? What can be done to improve this impact? I think I assume it is directed to all four of you. So who wants to? Yeah, Ching.
Yeah, maybe I'll just start off. I think, we have seen impact, particularly around the rights-based approaches, human rights-based approaches. And thanks to the hard work of many social movements, indigenous peoples organizations, and all the different constituency, there is good language and good text on these issues. But of course, this is only the beginning, as Vivienne said, and we will have to still monitor implementation on the ground. We will have to still hold our governments responsible. I think what we can learn from this is really that there is a need for much stronger civil society response across constituency, working with the other groupings, whether it's women or youth, indigenous peoples, farmers. And really, because we want to fight for the things that we believe in, we want to fight for justice and equity, and to ensure, obviously that the planet is also protected at the same time. And we can't do this on our own. We need to cross and reach out to other constituencies and also across different fora. For example, colleagues working in the climate justice movement, in the debt justice movement, trade justice movement. There are many other of these issues are intersecting. And if we really want to address systemic issues that drive biodiversity loss, we are going to have to also address this on a systemic level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ching. I see even Nele raised her hand. Nele.
Yes, I think this is a really good question. And I'd also like to take it together with the next question, which is by Helena. And how does the CBD Alliance plan to go forward on all these issues? And I think both questions go very much together. I think indeed the influence of civil society has been seen on issues such as human rights, etc. But even on those things where actually we do complain, I think we have had influence. Let me just give a few examples. For example, in Target 15, where I'm very critical of, but the fact that it starts with take legal, administrative, and policy measures, I think is due to the work of civil society. I'm also very critical of the fact that still it is possible to use offsetting as an outcome. It will be possible, most probably, to use offsetting under the CBD and to claim that one has actually positive outcomes in general. But it's not there in a very explicit way, and they've really backed away from doing so because of all the critique they've been using. If you remember how much hype there was around the concept nature positive, and nature positive just does not appear. And we've even seen people who were in the very beginning of the COP really pushing for it. And by the end of the COP saying like, well, we'll let go of the concept, we can't further defend it. So this is due to the influence of civil society. And it is because we are making clear that some things are just not coherent. And they are afraid of us, which is also a reason why we can feel that sometimes there are people wanting to influence the CBD Alliance or other civil society spaces from the outside. So that's something to take into account. Now, going on into the question, like how does the CBD Alliance plan to go forward? I think we still need to set up a decent plan, but I would really propose that we come together in different working groups on, for example, have a proposal for what we think mainstreaming should look like, just as we did for the global biodiversity framework. We did the do's and don'ts, we did the ingredients. We should do something like that for mainstreaming. We should also come up with coherent proposals around, for example, the whole equity issue and things like that. We should organize around issues such as how can we challenge states who allow certification schemes which are really providing unfair and inaccurate information and therefore wrongly influencing consumers, to challenge that. I think these kind of things are very, very important, and we need to set up internal commissions on that. And that seems like quite important. Another thing which we really need to do is to set up internal coordination so that between all the different countries, there can be learnings around the national strategies and action plans. I think these are very important, and we need to organize our internal coordination and make sure that whatever happens in one country can serve as a learning for another country. Thank you.
Thank you, Nele, so much. Thank you so much, everyone. I also request the speakers here to see one last time at the Q&A feature and respond if you want. So because we are limited in time, we have only 4 minutes. So I think we have to wrap up this session. I really appreciate your time and to participate in this wonderful webinar organized by CBD Alliance. Dear colleagues, if I have to take this final opportunity to express myself, our resilience in the face of disaster is a rare quality, and our massive tampering with the world's interdependent web of life, coupled with this environmental damage inflicted by deforestation, species loss, climate change, could trigger widespread adverse effects, including unpredictable collapses of critical biological systems, whose interactions I think we imperfectly understand still now. Now, I think more than 1 or few decades remain before the chance to avert the threats we now confront will be lost, and the prospects of humanity will be immeasurably diminished. As civil societies and right holders group, our effort should be to continue this momentum to campaign consistently and remind governments the commitments they made in December 2022. And we need this continuous campaigning on issues such as corporate capture, offsetting, GMOs. And now promises are made. Now it is us all, it is also us, up to all of us, how we influence these promises to become action and reality. I'm a person who believes in optimism. Hopefully, we remain all of us optimism and conserve biodiversity. Can I ask all of you to switch on the cameras? Is that possible? Maybe all people who can switch on their cameras just to take a snap to cherish this memory. Okay, we have one more. Let me take. Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I also like to, on behalf of CBD Alliance, like to express gratitude to Fawn, Anna Di Pangracio, her team members, Anna, Alejandra, all the wonderful interpreters here for organizing and supporting this webinar. And hopefully we will have further webinar, and also there will be a publication or public special issue of CBD Alliance Eco Bulletin coming up, which I think I will be forwarding to all of you very soon. And that will be uploaded also in the CBD Alliance website, and the recording of this will be uploaded in the CBD Alliance website along with the presentations. So thank you so much, everyone, for taking your time. And with that, we can wrap up the session.
Thank you, Bharath.
Hasta pronto, gracias.
Okay, goodbye. See you.